We come to the 11th presentation, and in a couple of days, 7 space shuttle astronauts will join the 6 scientists on the International Space Station, and for the first time ever in human experience, they will dine together, and that will be the first supper. We live in an age that dwarfs magic by the cosmic resonances and harmonics that are happening as we speak. We're looking at shared presence, the way in which over tens of thousands of years our kind has evolved and refined to this new threshold where we are expanding ourselves, not just off-world, not just above the world, but carrying a quality of into ourselves where we expand what we call the world to whole star systems. One of the most peculiar thresholds was in the development of drama in the Middle Ages. There was a peculiar of the way in which a church, a cathedral, would be built and would be designed. This is a reproduction of the symbolic floor plan and diagram from a 2-volume classic set called The Medieval Stage by E.K. Chambers. Later on, he would do a 4-volume set called by Oxford University Press in the 1920s and reprinted since. In here, there is a column with a bird on top, and it is labeled B, the 3 divisions of the stage corresponding to the church. The bird on top of the column is one of the most ancient of all symbols and iconographic holy space holders. The first time that this occurs in a symbolic in France, in the Paleolithic cave, the most famous of all the Paleolithic caves, Lascaux. Tunneling down the cave originally went far enough away that there was complete darkness in the long hall, almost like the nave of church. And in order to do the paintings in Lascaux, some 20,000 years ago, small hand-held oil lamps fashioned out of clay were used because these were found in Lascaux when it was discovered. And the first little book to come out for the popular consumption was a Pelican book in 1940. The development of Lascaux shows that this long passage, the first image that you come to on the left is the head and neck of a black stallion. And that black stallion is the very first iconographic image symbol that one sees. And as you go down this long passageway, right at the very end of it, there is a stalagmite hanging down, and on it is the black stallion again, almost like an artist's signature that the painter, the architect of this cave is Black Stallion. And then coming back on the other side of the same room, the same long cave passage, there is an array called the Chinese horses, because they look for all the world like the plump Tang dynasty horses of the royalty of the time of Tang Taizong. When you come back, though, before you complete the ambit of this long hall, as it were, there is a side passage which goes off. And this side passage goes off for a very long way, and down near the far end of it is called the chamber of the felines, because there are a lot of hunting lions that are largely lionesses there. But before you get to that, there's a spur that comes off. And this spur goes just a little ways, and then it drops off about 35, 40 feet. On the wall, about maybe a third of the way down, is painted a rhinoceros and a man who is fingers splayed. It looks like he's shrieking. His penis is erect. He's obviously scared to death. And he has a bird's head. He has also what looks like an abstract rod or staff. The discoverers, the archaeologists of Lascaux, in looking at the debris at the bottom of this shaft, found bits of braided cord from 20,000 years ago. So that obviously what had happened there is that in the initiation, after having gone through Black Stallion's hall, and before you get to the far distant realm of the felines, one goes through a transformation experience in which you are bungee corded off into the darkness to what would seem to you your certain death. You do not die, but you are shown that you can survive this kind of ultimate fright. There are many advanced meditations where you can do this with less fanfare but no less peril. And physiologically what happens is that the fright emotion wells up in your body, in your neural system, and it goes as far as the pate of the head. It does not go any farther than the crown of your cranium. Your hair may stand on end, but the neural fright does not go any further than that, but you do. The experience is one of hovering above and being able, in a sudden expansiveness that seems to have no end, that one has entered into a field of blessedness that fright cannot reach, that fear cannot interface with, that death has no place there whatsoever. This is a sacred space, and it is the sacred space above what would be the crown of your head. If it were closed, you would be trapped within that physiological body. You would suffer death. You would suffer the fright. You would suffer the fear. But if that chakra, it's called the Saharastra chakra, is open, then you are able to hover above, to exist in a dimension beyond the physical, the neurological, the mental conception of who it is that you are. in body, in deed, and in thought, that you have an extended, not existence, but that you have an extended presence. And so just as existence comes out of the field of nature, presence comes out of the field of vision. And the field of vision is like a quintessential fifth dimension and conveys then forms that are able to go to higher dimensions than just space-time, to forms that are more spectrumed than the forms of existence. The forms of existence like to have unity. They like to be. They like to come through to emergence and be there. Whereas forms that come out of the field of vision, out of the fifth dimension of consciousness, have a prismatic, jewel-like quality. The way through to that jewel-like dimension of visionary consciousness, out of which can emerge the perfected person. The tried and true way is to make a gamut of polarities, of opposites, arrayed and arranged so that at a certain threshold, they will all shift their polarity into complementarity. All of them at once. And it's like setting up the gates. And when one has gone through the gates of the polarities without being stopped by them, without being intimidated by them, going through the last gate allows one to look back down the entire gamut and to see that the thread that held those polarities now is the part of the openness of the field of differential consciousness that changed them into complementarities. At that point, one realizes for the first time, and the word is realizes, that there is a real that is more comprehensive than existence. That reality is with more dimensions than space-time has in its integral cycle. And so the ancient image for that, some 15,000 years after Lascaux, was a spirit bird that brings an eternity sign. In ancient Egypt, it was like the circle with a horizon tangent to the bottom of it. And this was brought, the ancient Osirian myth is that the hawk spirit bird, Horus, brings us as the gift of eternity, for one. The interesting thing here in the medieval stage is that there are 22 different stages in this medieval cathedral, high medieval cathedral, and they match up with the 22 major arcana cards of the tarot deck. A recension of the tarot deck that goes back to a very ancient quality, because the Renaissance tarot decks that came out, as we have looked at in previous presentations here, had 50 cards in 5 sets of 10, whereas the 22 cards of the major arcana go above the 4 suits of the tarot deck. And those 4 suits of the tarot deck have a definite relationality to the Arthurian Grail mythos. And the 22 cards of the major arcana are a para quality. The 21st card is the world card that has a wreath through which a beautiful nude woman is dancing through, coming into the higher world. All of these 21 cards are arranged so that there are 3 sets of 7 against the background of the 22nd card that is not labeled 22 but is labeled 0, the Fool card. So that the Fool card, being a 0, is the context within which the other 21 arrange themselves in 3 sets of 7. But if one did not know that it is not a fool, but is the context that would fool you, if you did not know it was the context of all. This ancient pattern goes back to the Gospel according to John. The 21 chapters of the Gospel of John are arranged in 3 sets of 7. And each of those 3 sets of 7 are a way of making a Sabbath out of a cycle. And so one has 3 sets of the Sabbath. And it is from the ancient lectionary cycle, so called, that when coming back from the exile, the reinstatement of the ancient Jewish tradition, the Torah, and the prophets that were being added to constantly at that time, and not yet the beginning of the books of wisdom other than Solomon's Proverbs and the Song of Songs. The quality in St. John's Gospel is that each set of the 7 is the symbol of the reading of the Torah out loud to all of the gathered men. And that by reading the Old Testament out loud, it took a series of 3 years of Sabbath in order to read all the way through it. So that the hearing of the law was something that you were constantly immersed in, and every 3 years you would have heard it all. By that time, you would be coming back like a corkscrew delving in, that you were getting more and more insight into how this not just connected together, but how it flowed in this spiraling in. And that as it spiraled in, by sharing this with all of the men of the community every Sabbath, wherever they would gather for their Sabbath ceremony, the entire male population would have heard the law together, would have established something which was like an extended spectrum that they heard together, they delved together, and the community grew together in its coherence. So that after a 3-year cycle, one would be ready to renew altogether the entire community of the masculinity, to renew at the same time together the hearing again. The Gospel of St. John is the hearing of a new lectionary cycle, that of Jesus. It is not the Old Testament, but it is the compressed, powerful New Testament. It is the covenant of the way in which one can now hear the new step. And the new step is one of going beyond the limitations of the existential, of going beyond the capping of the neurological, of going above the mental satisfacted completeness into a new space, a sacred space. This quality has a peculiar way of penetrating. Here is the way in which, in the Odes of Solomon, written, I believe, by Mary Magdalene, expressed it. The Lord is on my head like a crown, and I shall never be without him. Plaited for me is the crown of truth, and it caused thy branches to blossom in me. For it is not like a parched crown that blossoms not. But thou livest upon my head, and have blossomed upon me. Thy fruits are full and complete. They are full of thy salvation. Now, one of the earliest trees like this comes from ancient Egypt, and the symbol for it was that of a tree. It's called the Persea tree in ancient Egyptian symbolic mythology. Persea, the Persea tree. On one side of the tree is Thoth, who is keeping track of the balance of one's life, that you are justified. And justified because the balance is always like a scale. On one part is the plume of a feather, the feather of Ma'at, of truth, of the bird of spiritual truth, balancing your heart. He holds a staff, which has like a little lantern, and within that lantern is the balance that is showing a radiance of spiritual light by which he can read and write. And as he is writing, a goddess named Seshet is also writing a name. And as they write together, they write the name on the leaves of the Persea tree. And once your name is recorded on the tree of life, you are a part of eternal life. This is the record. This is the recording. This is the eternalizing of your name. It will always be remembered. It will be a part of the tree of life. And seated before it is that person for whom this has been performed. And they are on a kind of a high chair, and that high chair reoccurs again and again in the iconography of spiritual symbols throughout all time. We will next week take a look at the way in which such a high chair re-emerged, not in Egypt, not in Hellenistic times, in what we are familiar with, but resurfaced in India, taken there to Amaravati on the Krishna River, coming off the Bay of Bengal and going inland. And there, under the stupa, which is definitely Buddhist, but has underneath it something that one did not have before in Buddhism. You have the open space of the empty chair, the back of which has a tree very much like a symbolic abstract of the Persea tree, of the tree of life, that one is welcomed to the presence that you do not see any one there iconographically, or in terms of image, or in terms of symbol, is the good news. Because by not having something existential there, something that is not symbolically integral, one has the open space. And this is extremely important. Later on, some 800 years after that, when the spread of the Mahayana, with its early Hellenistic, Jewish, Alexandrian, Christian weaving together, and was taken from China, from Chang'an, by a monk, his Japanese monk. His name was Kobodaishi, also known as Kukai. He found there in the capital of Tang, China, in Chang'an, a great stela that was carved, and I will bring next week a reproduction of it. It still exists. That the great supreme religion of the entire universe is commemorated here, and one sees on the top of that stela the kind of esoteric cross that one would have, not a cross of crucifixion, but a cross of an arrangement of 4 sets of 3 into a 12-part energy radiance. And that stela was reproduced and taken to Japan. And on a sacred mountain, Mount Hiei, where one would go up hundreds and hundreds of steps, long steps like logs with tamped earth, going seemingly forever. At the top, the temple on Mount Hiei has a low lentil beam, very wide, maybe 20, 30 feet wide, so that one has to stoop to get inside. And when one stoops and comes under the beam, it's like bowing, because that's the only way you can get in, and one stands up. That temple is empty. Were there to be anything in it, it would be a sacrilege. It is the complete, perfect openness of the presence, which makes it shareable regardless of your background in language, in your image base of iconography, in your preference of expectations, in whatever way that you have arranged for yourself, feelings and images, and the way in which they roll the language of human experience. This is now a threshold that has gone beyond. The ancient name for it was the Parayana, the way beyond. This is a quality that is there, and the difference is the difference between an inheritance and a heritage. An inheritance is something mythic, whereas a heritage is something historic. There's all the difference in the world. An inheritance is a lineage. It's something that is passed on. Something that is passed on from father to son, passed on through the family, or passed on through the clan, passed on through the tribe, and even an inheritance can be passed on through a nation. All of this occurs on the mythic level, the mythic horizon of natural life, which comes full circle because one can then symbolize that, moving through the nature, through the ritual, through the myth, through the symbols, to a completeness, to a closure. An inheritance that is passed on repeats it as a cycle. Each generation will do this. Whereas a heritage is different. A heritage is like the vision of a species, the vision of a mankind. That kindred spirits across space and time become persons who are related in spirit families. That one now has not just clans, but one has the shared threads of resonances. One has not just the different tribes, but that the whole tribal eye has been expanded so that one is able to see the larger vision and to expand possibilities through the remembering not just the tradition itself, which requires then the explanation of what the tradition is and what it means, in symbolic terms, the exegesis. An inheritance must be passed on in lineages with an eye towards the tradition and the repeating of the exegesis so that it is marked in just the exact way. Whereas an inherent quality, though it seems coherent, a heritage is something which is unlimited. It is a vision which has not an exegesis but a mystery. The mystery is not a mystery of not knowing, but the mystery of knowing as far as you have gone that there is more indefinitely. Not that you are missing it, but that it is explorable, that it is able to be entered into. When the 13 astronauts sit down for the first supper of mankind above the earth, they will be about 220 miles above the earth. If they turn around and look through the other side of the portholes, there is no limit to how far they can look. The quality is open, not only as far as one could see, but as far as one could ever hope to determine to see, in the sense that the Hubble Space Telescope a number of years ago took a blank area of the night sky in between galaxies, not stars, but galaxies as far as one could go, and then trained itself on this blank space and left its sensitive cameras going for a long time, many, many hours, many days. And when that film was developed, instead of being a blank sky, the light from almost 12 billion light years away had brought so many unseen, heretofore invisible galactic structures that it looked like chipboard. That there is a quality that we have actually brought our existence, our symbolic integral, to that classic wisdom threshold where we can together share the presence of a universe, and that universe has a familiar tone to it. It has the tone of home. It is extraordinary. That is not fearful. It is blessed. The very first human being to ever experience that was Colonel Ed White on one of the Gemini flights with Jack McDivitt. He was the first human being to make a spacewalk. And he went out of the Gemini capsule. And the umbilical that linked him to the breathing and the electronic apparatus was coated in gold. So that when he exited from the Gemini capsule, he actually floated free away from the capsule because he was tethered by the gold umbilical cord. And Ed White, being an old fighter pilot, Korean vintage hero, looked and raised his hand to shield the brilliant sunlight so that he could look at the earth. And suddenly it occurred to him that his hand had eclipsed the entire earth. And so he turned and looked out the other way. And the NASA transcripts get a little garbled here. All that one hears, mission control telling McDivitt, he's not responding. He's not coming back in. Well then, Captain McDivitt, pull on the umbilical cord and pull him back in, because White was not going to go back. He had already seen the light. Let's take a break. Let's come back to another quality that occurs. In reality, there are truly magical things. There are mysterious processes. This is a copy made of something that is purely in black ink, but was getting towards the end of the color toner, not the black toner. And so the red of the color toner bled into the image. This is an alchemical image I did in 1990, taking the ancient portrait of Jesus and putting it before an alchemical flask and putting in it the dark, unknown alchemical quality, and inset into that the ancient Horus hieroglyph with the eternity sign in it. This is not just red, this is a rosy red. Years ago, this was done in 1990, I was teaching at that time still at the Philosophic Research Society on Los Feliz Boulevard. I had been there for 10 years at that time. I taught every other day for 10 years. That's a yoga. One of the things that I had just researched at that time was an esoteric book, the only copy in the world, in the vault, Manly Hall's personal private vault, not just in the library, but the vault in his, adjacent to his office. And I was doing research in it because it's not printed, it's written in ink so old that it looks brown now on yellowed parchment-like paper. It's entitled Secret Manuscript in German, and it has a black cross on the title page, but the black cross has a slight tilt to it so that you can see that the interior of it is this rosy red light. It is the founding esoteric manuscript of the Rosicrucians, the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. And in that book are the original graduation documents for the great alchemical philosopher Dr. Paracelsus. One by his alchemical mentor, whose name was Solomon Trismoson, and one by his esoteric meditation alchemy mentor, whose name was Trithemius. And those documents are the original diplomas given secretly in that lineage to make the focus of both the mining metallurgical aspect of alchemy and the spiritual contemplative aspect of alchemy to meet together in the spirit person prism of Paracelsus, who became one of the great figures in the Renaissance. When this happened, I remembered that document. So I made a copy then of my portrait that I found of Mary Magdalene, and she recorded all in rosy light. This portrait of Mary Magdalene comes from this symbol icon, part of a fresco from the shores of the Euphrates River at a place called Dura. It's called Dura Europos archaeologically. Was found in the 1920s by military men looking for a good place to put a fortress, and they found that underneath the desert sands there in Iraq next to the Euphrates was an ancient fortress city, and that it had been besieged, and that in it there was a Jewish synagogue and there was a Christian church, and that they had been built in the roughly the early 240s AD, and had been built against one of the city walls, the back wall, facing the Euphrates River. And during the siege, the top part of this wall had fallen and buried a couple of the back wall of the synagogue and the Christian church, and parts of the other walls coming out from them. And so they were perfectly preserved from the middle of the 3rd century AD, and images going back. And these are the three Marys at the tomb of Jesus for his resurrection. And there is a band of rosy light spanning the three figures, and they are holding the material that they brought to the tomb to finish the anointing of the dead body of Jesus. And of course, the tomb was empty. Not only empty, but because one of the figures was Mary Magdalene, the middle figure was Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the farther figure here was Mary, the daughter of the Mother Mary. Mary, the mother, had 9 children. Mary Magdalene had no children. She was really the Virgin Mary. But she adopted, because Jesus assigned the adoption on the cross, for her to adopt young John to be her son, and told young John, "This is now your mother." So when they went to Ephesus together, the first thing that Mary Magdalene did, as not only the adopted mother for him, but as the incredible mentor of spiritual depth, she prepared him for his bar mitzvah, because he was only 12 years old at the crucifixion resurrection, and had a year to go before he would be 13 and have his bar mitzvah. And his bar mitzvah was done in Ephesus. And we know that all of this is not only true, because St. John writes it so, and says, all of this is true, because we know he who writes this was the beloved disciple, and we know his testimony is true. But archaeologically, we can find the tomb of St. John in Ephesus. We can find the tomb of Mary Magdalene in the cave of the seven sleepers, which is like a large cave that looks for all the world like one of the great Paleolithic caves. And there is a huge sarcophagus there that has a top that rolls almost like the top of Le Corbusier's Chapel at Ronchamp, and has huge energy swirls, grand energy swirls on it. And the sarcophagus was large enough to contain two bodies together. Mary, the mother, was interred there, and Mary Magdalene was interred there as well. And because of the very high dimensional energy, it meant a tuning almost permanently of the two Marys together, because they were buried together in such a way that their bones were literally one tined, tuned pair instrument. The bones of John the Baptist are also mixed with other bones, and one of the other sets of bones that it is mixed with is those of Alexander the Great. So that John the Baptist and Alexander the Great's bones have been together now for almost 1,700 years, and they're in the Egyptian Western Desert at the Makarios, Mar Makarios Monastery. And I will bring some more information next week about that. One of the qualities that we're getting to is that shared presence has higher registries. And those higher registries are able to be now, in our time, appreciated. One of the aspects of my work coming out is to deliver this white paper on the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem is a planetary park. I have not included all of the developments of it in this initial single page, but I want to expand upon it. To solve an intractable stalemate requires further dimensions. To vision a new solution. The first dimension is consciousness. Another is history. They are linked by those with a prismatic humanity. This is the vision of our New Jerusalem Planetary Park. It places the full spectrum of history into a workable achievement, which allows for Israel, Palestinian people, and a planetary, not global, which is political and national, future humanity to secure a spirit-led peace. This is to be the first planetary park. The United Nations, for instance, is a global entity about nations in a political format. The New Jerusalem Planetary Park is about mankind as a species. We are a newly refined and expanded species, able to look at our planet as a whole, and a special jewel in the solar system. Thus, the entire star system is an expanded ground for our best future. Few places match a New Jerusalem as a pivotal place for our emerging future. Three great religions vie for control of the current Jerusalem on historical grounds. This now opens them to weaving a future fabric, a new rainbow coat. To set aside the city of Jerusalem and its immediate surrounding territorial and historical context as a new form, not a city per se, but a special area exemplary of our best future, a planetary park. This will be a self-governing area open to world travel, commerce, and sustainable, in addition, by a 1% tax write-off for any in the world who choose to do so, endorsing it. This is a micro-tithe, indeed, yet significant as a visionary act around our planet, significant for all nations and religions. This beacon of mankind transforms all previous empires and prophecies. A new time form calls out for fresh responses and novel possibilities. Mount Nebo is the first vision of the Promised Land by Moses, and his last resting place, the planetary park, starts here. It runs down to the Jordan River, including both banks of Wadi al-Qarar, crossing the Jordan at this point and climbing the road up to Jerusalem so that the road is included in the park. Greater Jerusalem is the focal area and includes Bethlehem. From Bethlehem down Wadi Mahash to Mitzpeh Shalem on the Dead Sea, a diagonal line across the Dead Sea to Mount Nebo. This planetary park provides a way for the two-state solution to take form. A highway linking to Gaza would be a park extension free to all, open to the Mediterranean Sea, and along the northern border of Gaza as a vision buffer. A 4 square mile seaport would link the planetary park to the shipping world. Palestine secure, bridged by the park. Israel would have security, vision fruitful. That seaport, I suggest the name of Port Isaac, being the son of the lineage of Abraham, the inheritor of the patriarchal lineage that founds Judaism, the Judaism of the rabbis, the current Israelis. Port Isaac would be a new seaport, allowing for the Palestinians in Gaza to develop a little seaport next to it, contiguous to it on their land, and the Israelis to develop another little seaport contiguous to it on their land, but that the 2 square miles on either side of the road going to the Mediterranean Sea would constitute Port Isaac for the planetary New Jerusalem Planetary Park. That the road coming up from there naturally would climb into the mountain ridge hills around Hebron. And in Hebron, there would be a resting spot where Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah as a burying place. And there, another portion of the planetary park would be a large rest stop for traffic and visitors coming from the Mediterranean Sea up to the ridge where further from Hebron is Bethlehem and Jerusalem. So that one would have from Port Isaac up to the traditional tomb of Abraham, over to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, down to the Jordan River near the Dead Sea, and also down to the Dead Sea. It would be a point somewhat south of Ein Gewer, if you can imagine that there's an Ein Gewer. My father's name was Guy Weir. So there are peculiarities that are here. All the way to Mount Nebo. And on the far side of Mount Nebo, to establish there an international airport and call it Ishmael. And it would not only be an international airport, but it would be a spaceport. It would have facilities for the coming space tourism, space travel, to go to the International Space Station and other destinations. so that you would have an Isaac and an Ishmael, the two sons, one carrying Judaism, the other carrying Islam, and that they would be the great parentheses from the Mediterranean to that part of the environment of Mount Nebo, so that one would have this kind of lightning-like shape linking and buffering at the same time the Israelis and the Palestinians, that they would share along with the rest of the world, the rest of the planet, something which would then give us not only a peace in the region, a peace between religions, but a way to eventually have a solution where many planetary organizations would choose to make themselves at home in the New Jerusalem Planetary Park. Cognate with that would be 4 other sites that later in the 21st century could be added as also smaller planetary parks associated with the spectacular pivot which Jerusalem and Bethlehem are. One of those sites is in Egypt, west of Alexandria, about 30 miles, Taposiris Magna. Another would be in the west of Britain, Glastonbury Cathedral and surrounding terrain, including the Tor. Another would be Ephesus, which is abandoned and is just a massive archaeological site with just a few villagers. And a fourth would be St. Thomas Hill in southern India, and the larger city now used to be called Madras, is called Chennai. Those 4 planetary parks are related to the Jerusalem-Bethlehem, the New Jerusalem Planetary Park, like the fingers of a hand, where the New Jerusalem is like the thumb. Those 5 sites are the original apostolic vision of Jesus, stretching from the Irish Sea to the Bay of Bengal, stretching from the Greek Aegean lands all the way down to the beginnings of the Egyptian lands. This is an extraordinary way to reintroduce into a population on the planet that the massive inheritance lineages can be woven into a heritage, a planetary heritage. There are more than 1 billion Christians. There are more than 1 billion Muslims. There are tens of millions of Jews. But it is a quality where the planet now is jeopardized as a global construct and needs to be revivified as a planetary living being. The earth is alive. It is a living entity. Her name, the earth is feminine, is Terra. And instead of calling it the earth, as if it were some kind of neutered object, one now refers to her as Terra. We are terrestrials, not earthlings. And terrestrials, even stepping only 200 miles into space, are already extraterrestrials. So we need to reform our vocabulary and not talk about aliens and earthlings. Not talk about terrestrials as if they were limited to just this place, this world. And a better usage would be then to modify our species from Homo sapiens sapiens to Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man. We became Homo sapiens sapiens about 40,000 years ago with the development of art. Art that in the Paleolithic caves, for the very first time, showed an ability of our species to do something that was so far beyond nature as to give an insight into the capacities of man wise enough to be wise about being wise. About 30 years ago, a husband and wife archaeological, paleontological team went into investigating all of the Paleolithic caves, and the wife was interested in the technology, the paints that were used in the caves. And so they did a chemical analysis of these colors. And they found that they were not simple colors, that there were recipes for each of the colors, and that the different clays and the different elements that went into them, for the black it was manganese, etc., that they came from a very wide area of southern France and of northern Spain. So that in order to make these paints, there had to be a network of trade and communication that spread over a rather large part of 2 European countries. And that this was extraordinary because the way in which this was utilized, the earliest caves that we know of now, Cosquer, which is on the outskirts of the city of Marseille in southern France, goes back about 35,000 years. The latest caves come up to about 13,000 years. We're given to understand that Homo sapiens sapiens, for almost 25,000 years, preserved a Paleolithic civilization that was able to express by art the vision and the spiritual persons that prismatically come out of that vision. We have now entered a place where for the last roughly 5,000 years, increasingly what has come to be by the side of art is science. Not only a science, but a development thereof by which mathematics, about halfway back, about 2,500 years ago, underwent a tremendous increase in capacity. The adding of a mathematic as a universal language to a science that already by that time was several thousand years old led to a development which is reported. The earliest figure that we have that is masterful in this is Pythagoras. And next week we're going to talk more about the Pythagorean inheritance, which initially was a lineage, an inheritance. And that lineage, that inheritance, lasted about 10 generations. The first generation from Pythagoras was a small coterie of people. One of the most conspicuous men was Parmenides, who we've talked about in this series. Another later on was Empedocles, and there was a female Diotima of Mantinea. Mantinea is in Greece, in the northern part of the Peloponnese. She was a first-generation Pythagorean, and she passed it on to a second-generation Pythagorean named Socrates, who passed it on to a third-generation Pythagorean whose name was Plato, who passed it on to Aristotle in the fourth generation, who passed it on to Alexander the Great in the fifth generation, whose contemporary Ptolemy the first Ptolemy in the Ptolemaic dynasty, was a contemporary of his. He studied with Alexander the Great under Aristotle. So Ptolemy the first, named Soter, Savior in Greek, was a fifth generation and passed it on to his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who then would be a sixth generation Pythagorean. That Ptolemy was born on the island of Kos in the Aegean. And if you look at Kos, it is midway between Samos, which is where Pythagoras' childhood was from, and Halicarnassus, which is one of the sophisticated sites for understanding history and for building incredible. One of the seven wonders of the ancient world was the mausoleum in Halicarnassus. And it was the original mausoleum because the king, the great king for whom it was built, King Mausolus, the name mausoleum is taken from that. So Ptolemy Philadelphus is the sixth. His son, Ptolemy III Erigetes, would be the seventh, and the eighth generation would be the fourth Ptolemy, who's the one who built the great temple of Osiris at Taposiris Magna. There are 14 temples to Osiris because his body was divided mythologically into 14 parts by his adversary Set, who wanted to destroy him, but whose body parts were recollected, the recollection of the parts of Osiris, so that he could be remembered and brought back whole by Isis, who was then able to conceive of Horus through the act of this recollection, of this remembering, so that Horus is not an existential son, but is rather a heritage son. The way in which an inheritance and a heritage are brought together is by way of spirit family adoptions. That one can choose to belong to a spirit family or have a spirit family adopt you as a part of its way of braiding together inheritance and heritage. This is the third Ode to Solomon by Mary Magdalene that speaks to this. I am putting on the love of the Lord, and his members are with him, and I am dependent on them, and he loves me. For I should not have known how to love the Lord if he had not continuously loved me. Who is able to distinguish love except him who is loved? I love the beloved, and I myself love him. And where his rest is, there also am I. And I shall be no stranger, because there is no jealousy with the Lord Most High and Merciful. I have been united to him because the lover has found the beloved. I have been united because I love him that is the Son, I shall become a son. Indeed, he who is joined to him, who is immortal, truly shall be immortal. And he who delights in the life will become living. This is the Spirit of the Lord, which is not false, which teaches the sons of men to know his ways. Be wise and understanding and vigilant. Hallelujah. This was written about 2,000 years ago. We have been preparing an original tuning fork that happened 2,000 years before Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It happened about 2000 BC. The tuning fork then was one tine was Semitic, the other tine was Aryan. That there are a tuning fork 2000 BC. The Semitic tine is Abraham, the Aryan tine is Zarathustra. Both of them, when they were 75 years of age, created something that developed into a lineage. At 75, Abraham left Haran in northern Mesopotamia and was invited to go to the promised land that would be shown to him. Zarathustra, when he was 75, finally wrote down his Gathas. Both of these would have been about 1925 BC. So that you have the development which resurfaced at the same time about 1,500 years later. Zarathustra was revived by the Achaemenid dynasty under Cyrus the Great in Persia, in ancient Iran. And he's the one that released the Jews from the exile bondage and allowed them to go back to the promised land. So that the revival of Zarathustra and the revival of the Jews in the promised land are tuned. They're toned and tuned events together. Here is my translation of two of the hots of the 47th yasna. I'll translate the names. Harvatat and Amaratat are health and immortality. They're like spirits. They're called Amesha Spantas. They're holy spirits. And they're always twins. They're always together. Real health and immortality are resonant together. Mazda is like the radiance of Ahura Mazda. Kshatra is the patience. Armati is the love. And Ahura is the Lord of life. So here's the translation. Pure spirit and best mind, through Asha in deeds and words, to those be given Harvatat, Amaratat, Mazda's Kshatra, Armati, Ahura. The guiding spirit is our purest paradise. Pronounced words according to mind, of Armati with interfolded hands, fulfilling the unique wisdom which fathers Asha, Mazda. It's a way of saying that the fathering of the feminine order allows for her to bring the way to radiance to consciousness. In Greek mythology, Athena is born of Zeus and is able, through her ability to bring the radiance of wisdom through the interfering ways of war. She is armored, as Athena is, in a very special way. On her breastplate is the head of the Medusa. On the inside of her shield is a coiled python. Only Athena can hold the shield of the infinity sign Python from the great achievement of Apollo being able to slay the python, the great serpent, the Apop of Egyptian mythology, the Typhon of Zeus mythology. The way in which it is slain is not by killing it, but by wrapping it into an infinity sign that now becomes a way of taking that serpent and allowing its spiral infinity to adorn the staff, which becomes the staff of the healer. Asclepius holds a staff which has become the symbol of medicine everywhere on the planet, and it comes from that. We're lucky here in Los Angeles, the Getty Museum has an original 5th century BC statue of Athena, and you can go and walk around it, and you can see on the inside of the shield that she holds the infinity python, and that is her shield. And she is able to be the conveyor of something that wisdom requires. The courage to do, then, from the vision that you have been given. Her even gray eyes, they're the color of the Aegean Sea when a storm is clearing off to the horizon. They might be blue in full sunlight, but they are now gray. It is that pearl gray that equanimously sees to the horizon that allows for the threshold into the curvature of the earth to become full round. More next week.